am the director of the basic education team in Save the Children US. This is a webinar to talk about the Education Equity Research Initiative. And what I'm going to do here is I'll give you a quick introduction to the initiative, and then I'll stop and sort of talk about equity in education and why they're important, and then we'll come back to the work of the Education Equity Research Initiative. So what the Education Equity Research Initiative is a collaborative partnership that connects organizations and individuals interested in improving data and evidence on education inequality and solutions for strengthening equity. And what that means is we are a group of organizations, researchers, NGOs, UN organizations that are interested in getting more and better information about equity in education. So how are groups of children, different groups of children, doing, whether children with disabilities, girls, rural children, urban children, all different socioeconomic groups. We started in March 2016, so we're about 18 months old. It is co-led by Save the Children and another organization here in the US called FHI 360. We have about 20 members. What we do is produce tools, background documents, guidance notes. We share these through events. We have a website, educationequity2030.org, and a newsletter. It has been, we have pretty broad participation from within Save the Children US. We also have Catherine Cooper from Save the Children UK, who has participated, and I think a number of staff from country offices have also joined, at least like the mailing list. I'm going to go on here. Just a little slow. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the difference between equity and equality. And they're important terms in our education work, just so we're clear about what we mean. And equality, when we talk about it in education, it's a bit more about, often about outcomes. And so if we look at how, if we talk about inequality, we're often talking about some children are doing better than others. There's inequality in learning outcomes, there's inequality in access rate, there's inequality in achievement. But when we talk about equity, we're talking about how a system treats the students within it. And so what we're talking about is an idea that that children have different needs, individually, and groups of children have different needs, and that an equitable approach is one that tries to provide what those children need to do well. So there's an important difference here between equity and equality, and I often think about it as a difference between sort of inputs, or if we're talking about what do we really mean, equity is often about inputs, and equality is about outcomes. And I'm just going to go ahead to the next slide here. There's a picture that I really like that sort of shows the difference between equity and equality. And the first slide looks at sort of equality. Each child is being given the same thing, but it's not sufficient for what they need. So the child on the right still isn't able to see over the fence. But if we think about equity and we think about fairness, the child on the right is given the 2 blocks, and the child in the middle is given 1, and that gets them to more equal outcomes, where each child has what they need to succeed, and success here is being able to look over the fence and watch the game. There are a couple other definitions or terms that I want to mention here, and they're outcomes and dimensions, because when we look at equity in education, what we're trying to think about is what works and for whom. And often in education, you'll see a discussion of what works. Everybody's always trying to figure out what works, in teacher training, or what works in curriculum development, or what works in getting children out of school, children into school. But often what's lost or what isn't considered in that analysis is the for whom part. What works for whom? And so you may say, okay, well, this kind of textbook works really well, but does it work equally well for children from the north of the country and the south of the country, or children in urban areas versus rural areas, or boys versus girls? And so being able to consider what works for whom is very important, particularly for an organization like Save the Children, where we are concerned with the most marginalized children, and wanting to ensure that those children's particular needs are understood, and that solutions that are developed for the education system in the country work for those children that we're trying to serve. So when we look at outcomes, we're often going to say, well, what works in terms of what we want to achieve, either in terms of access or learning achievement, or participation in the labor force. And you can see here some of the things that people measure. And the reason that outcomes, the outcome that you choose to measure when you're doing an analysis around education equality is, for example, if you look at girls, and you look at girls in the early primary grades, and let's say you look at their reading scores. In many countries, girls outperform boys on reading tests in the early grades. That's just sort of a global norm in education, that given equal opportunities, girls may outperform boys. And so you may think, if you just looked at that outcome, that girls are doing pretty well in the education system. But if you change your focus and outcome analysis to, let's say, graduation from secondary school, or outcomes in entering the labor force or having their skills recognized, you may see great disparities. And then you'll have to think a little differently about how the education system is treating both boys and girls. The other thing that I wanted to talk about here is dimensions. They're often considered sort of a big four dimensions that are often measured: gender or sex, the area of residence, whether a child is urban or rural, the geographic location in the country, what province or district they come from, and then also socioeconomic status or wealth. Those are the things that you most often see measured. But there are also other dimensions that may be of interest to Save the Children staff and the education partners that you work with in the country. You may want to know about children's ethnic or linguistic group, whether or not they have a disability, caste, religion, migration status, whether they're nomadic, and other barriers that might be relevant to them and access and success in education in their country. So equity, with that sort of thinking about equity that way, and equality and the different dimensions and outcomes and ways that we can look at this issue, you do see that equity is very prominent within the global education agenda now. Whether you're talking about Sustainable Development Goal 4, the Education 2030 Incheon Declaration, or even Save the Children's own education breakthrough, which says all children learn from a quality basic education. This idea of equity and equality is really at the heart of the SDG agenda. And so for Save the Children, we're going to need to get better at understanding what it means for us and how we're contributing to realizing that those different ambitions. So just a quick moment to say sort of why does equity matter? There are some debates around whether and why you may need to address the needs of the most marginalized first, or pay particular attention to them as a country develops. And there's been a lot of economic research on this, and I have two links at the bottom of this slide that I think are both very strong in making the case for why change with equity. So not, change for everyone, not just maybe change for the people at the top or the people in the middle, but change for all people in a country or a society are important. Save the Children published something called Ending the Hidden Exclusion, which looks at children who are in school but aren't learning. And UNICEF also published something called The Investment Case for Education and Equity. And these papers both make sort of three big points. The first is that when the gap between rich and poor in a country is wide, social cohesion and the cohesiveness of a society can be threatened. The second point is that high levels of inequality inhibit economic growth. So you actually see the countries that are more equal, where there's more equality, actually grow faster. And the third point that both of these papers make is that education is critical to responding to the challenge of inequality. And there are a number of ways that education contributes, both in terms of promoting a more level playing field, more equal opportunities, and that as more equal opportunities exist, income inequality is often reduced. So you can take a look at those. You can take a look at those later if you're interested. So let me go. I think I missed a slide here. Let me see if I can get this. So this is just a quick little video that we produced as part of the Education Equity Initiative that tries to sum up all of these ideas, and I think it maybe does it better than what I just did there.
Education equity in the very simplest terms is fairness in providing the opportunity to every child and youth to reach their full potential. We're not thinking about education equity as a state or a condition, but rather as a process and a pathway by which policy, programming, resources are addressed to meet the needs of the individual. There is a cost to education inequality. So not achieving a certain education based on your gender, based on your ethnicity, based on your socioeconomic status does have an impact on your life outcomes and outcomes for society at large. The ideal world that we can envision is where life opportunities and achievements and accomplishments are determined only by individual will and individual choice rather than factors that are outside of the control.
So that's just a little video that I think summarizes very nicely those different points. So the next thing that I want to talk about is sort of why are these ideas important for our programs, and maybe get a little into more detail about how they're important for our programs and how we can work on these issues through our programming and our advocacy work. And so I'm going to just make a couple of statements here from the beginning where I think that we have some challenges from what I've seen during my time working with Save the Children. And the first is that we often consider equity only at the start of a project or a program. And what I mean by this is that we try to target our projects toward a needy population, which we often do at the beginning. We'll do a situational analysis and decide where and who our programs are going to serve. But we often don't follow that analysis to see whether we've had an actual impact on equity and equality. And this is something that we can easily do, but we don't often do it, and we don't take the time necessarily to say, did we reduce inequity or inequality within this project? And I'll show you a couple examples of that. The second is that we often don't look at those different levels of equity and equality that I was that I talked about earlier. And what I mean by levels is we may say, well, we work in a very poor province in this country, and so we're trying to improve equity and equality in the country by working in this poor province and raising education standards there. And that's one level of equity, and it's a valid level of equity. But we can also look at a school level to say, okay, well, what's happening? Are children from particular schools doing better than others, and how is our program helping them, or even down to the individual child level, and looking at what individual children or groups of children may be struggling in our projects. And so looking across all of those levels at the same time can be a bit complicated, but I think it's essential to really do this kind of work well. The third statement I would make is that we make assumptions about who is being left behind, which may not be correct. And I'll show an example of this, something somewhat from our Guatemala project that Save the Children US is implementing with Save the Children International in Guatemala, which illustrates this point. And then the last statement I would make is that in order to do these things well, in order to move into a stronger position for Save the Children in terms of how we think about and act on equity and equality in education, we need better data and analyses to work with our partners to do this. And so these are four areas where I think that we can really improve. And I'm going to talk through a couple examples here to sort of show you what I mean. So in this example, I'm showing you here data. Let's pretend data that I made up, but let's pretend we had a reading program in a country, and I can tell you we did an evaluation on the project, and I can tell you that at the baseline, the children were reading, the average children were reading, or children on average were reading 10 words per minute. And at the end line, children were reading 20 words per minute. And you know, when we look at that information, we are very proud of the work that we and our partners have done, and we can show that to our donors, and feel good about how our project went, because we've doubled the reading skills of the children over the course of the project. But if we take the time to sort of disaggregate our data a bit, what we see is that, let me see if I can get this slide to come up, there we go, that what actually was happening in this project is that at the baseline, not every child was at 10 words per minute. What you actually had was about half the children at 0 words per minute and half the children at 20 words per minute. And what you see at the end line is that those children who were at 0 words per minute, they're still there, but that the children who were at 20 words per minute, they've moved up now to about 40 words per minute. So if you just look at averages in this, in our data and in our analysis, you can see that while again there were some gains for the project, they weren't all great, and there's still some questions that that a project team would need to think about and try to answer. I give a similar example here where we think about who's being left behind. And this is another sort of made-up project where at the baseline you have, let's say, 60% non-readers, 30% emerging readers, and 10% of the children are reading with comprehension. And then you look at your data at end line, and you can see that you've cut the number of non-readers in half. They're down to about 30%. Emerging readers are about 20%, and about 50% of the children are reading with comprehension. And again, by a lot of different standards, this is a very successful intervention. It has really changed the scores and skills for a large percentage of children. But to save the children, we still need to ask who's being left behind. Who are those 30% of children who are still not reading at end line? And we have to recognize that 30% of children is still quite a lot. And if we're an organization who is committed to serving the most marginalized, we need to know who those children are. And in order to know who those children are, this gets back to what I was talking about with the different dimensions. And, you know, are these children migrants? Are they working children? Are they children who come from a minority language group or a different caste? And so having good data, collecting data in our evaluations on who these children are and being able to analyze that data to understand who is being left behind. This is the essential work, I believe, of SDG 4 and over the next 13 years is really digging down and being very intentional about who we're serving and who we're not. And so I want to just close out this section with a real example from a Save the Children project in Guatemala that I mentioned earlier. And what I'm showing you here is this chart shows in gray baseline reading scores, and the red is the gain scores, the scores that are how children's reading scores improved over the course of the project. And what we're looking at here is schools. We're not looking at individual children, but we're looking at schools. And on the left side of the chart, you have children with the schools that have the fewest Spanish speakers. And the language of instruction in Guatemala is usually and often in Spanish. And so these are the schools where most of the children come into the school and they don't speak the language of instruction at home. Whereas over on the right-hand side of the chart, you see schools where there are 60 to 70% of children in the classroom speak that language, instruction, Spanish, at home. And the reason I present this chart is because when we started the project, we assumed that language would be a major issue that we would have to deal with. And it certainly is an issue in these areas, but what we see when we look at this school level analysis is that we really don't see any correlation between whether schools have lots of non-Spanish speakers or not. There are schools with very few Spanish speakers that are doing pretty well, and we also have schools with lots of Spanish speakers that aren't doing well. And so this caused the team in Guatemala to do some more analyses to see if they could understand what other factors might be very important in understanding whether children were learning to read at a school level. And one of the interesting things that they found here, and what I'm looking at here again is schools on this slide, they looked at whether, what the percentage of high or medium income children in the school was. And so this is a relatively poor province in Guatemala, so even children who are considered wealthy within that province, they're probably not very wealthy by the national standards. But if we looked at even sort of the poorest of the poor, so if you look onto the left-hand side of this chart, these are schools with very high percentages of very poor children. So that left-hand side has schools where 80 to 100% of the children are from the poorest group. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have schools where 80 to 100% of the children are from the medium or the high income group within the project. And here you see a really, really strong correlation. And it's very interesting to see on two levels. You see that at baseline scores, those gray bars, the schools where they have more better off children, they're doing better than the schools that have high concentrations of poverty. But you also see that, say, the children's own interventions are benefiting. So if you look at the red parts, our interventions are benefiting the schools where there are already more better off children. And so our intervention really barely benefits the schools with very high percentages of poor children. And this is not to certainly criticize the Guatemala project at all. They have very excellent results here across a range of schools and children. But it was something that was very eye-opening to the team in Guatemala. And so what they did was they decided they needed to go back to these schools and try to understand the poor schools, or the schools with high percentages of poor children. They needed to go back to those schools and try to understand what's going on here. Are these children from, communities where the children have to work in the afternoon? Do they attend very irregularly? Do they not have any books in their homes? Or do their majority of their parents, maybe their parents are not literate? So they wanted to go back, and they're doing right now some more qualitative research to try to understand what's going on in these schools with very high levels of poverty. And so their idea is that for the remainder of the project, because what we're looking at here is baseline and midline data, for the remainder of the project, they can better try to target their interventions, and they can better work with the district education offices to identify those schools that are the most in need and provide more equitable inputs to those schools, target more resources to them, and better serve the needs of those communities of children. So what I'm trying to describe here is that as Save the Children US in our basic education programs over the last 5 to 7 years was doing a lot of these reading projects, and we were analyzing a lot of data, we were finding sort of a blind spot. We knew that, as I showed in that second example, that there were children who were being left behind, and we knew we couldn't only look at averages. But we didn't often have very good data to help us answer the question of who's being left behind and what happens if we try not to look at averages. And the USDA data, in some ways, is a result of that process of learning, because we've gotten much better at collecting data on language, on socioeconomic status, in addition to sex and other data that we might have collected in the past. And so we felt that we sort of had this blind spot between that ambition of EFA 2030 and the SDG 4 and our own Every Last Child and All Children Learning global ambitions, and the data and the tools that we have within our project to try to make sure that we would actually reach all children through our projects and with our partners over the course of our strategic period. And so this was what led us to form the Education Equity Research Initiative with FHI 360. So just to say it again, what we saw in terms of a challenge was we felt like the first step to addressing inequality is to be able to see it, and that without a commitment to data and evidence, that inequality remains unreported and unaddressed. And that was what we saw as the challenge. And so when we formed the Education Equity Research Initiative with FHI 360, the things that we were trying to do are these sort of circles around the edge here. We were trying to tackle known data gaps. So we're trying to get better information about different types of children. We were trying to look at the effects of policy and program responses, like I was showing you in the Guatemala project there. Try to get better at understanding how are our projects doing in addressing problems of equality and thinking about equity. We wanted to shine a light on the connections between education, inequality, and fragility. And there's a whole working group within the Education Equity Research Initiative that just looks at conflict and fragility contexts. And then we also wanted to provide a vital learning forum to bring together collective knowledge and expertise, because we knew that Save the Children wasn't the only organization out there who was trying to think about these problems and grapple with these challenges. We happen to have probably more data than many organizations to think about this problem with, but there were definitely others out there who were trying to say, okay, if we want to reach all children, if that's our rhetoric, if that's our ambition, what does it really mean? How do we really understand who these children are and what do they need? So as I said at the start, the Education Equity Research Initiative is a collaborative partnership. It has individuals, implementing organizations like Save the Children, donors, UN organizations, research institutions. And we do really try to bring people together to get better as a group at generating evidence around equity in education programs and policies. And we really think this idea of a forum is important, because we know that if we each try to do this on our own, we won't get there by 2030. The only way we're going to accelerate progress is if we're working together and building off of each other's strengths and accomplishments. And I want to just, we don't have to read through this whole slide here, but there is a theory of change. And the reason that I mentioned the theory of change here for the Education Equity Research Initiative is that in some ways it's very similar to our own theory of change within Save the Children, and it ties together our programs to our partnerships and our work on policy advocacy. And so if you think about the theory of change, the goal, the idea at the end of the theory of change is that there is a more equitable education system in the country where we work, whether that's Malawi or Bangladesh or the United States or Norway or Korea. We want a more equitable education system in every country where we're working. And if we think back from how that happens, we think about the policymakers and the government actors, and including teachers, etc., who deliver education services on a daily basis. And so thinking about how is it that we use the results from our education programming to raise awareness around these issues, to have good data that presents a clear picture of what's happening within a country, who's being left behind and in what ways, and what needs to be done in order to make changes that will not continue to leave those children behind. And so if you're thinking about this from either a program design point of view and a member office or thinking about it from a country office perspective, this theory of change, of leveraging the experience that we have through our programmatic interventions to an interface with government and other national actors who can contribute to a more equitable education system. This is what we're really looking for. So in terms of things that, following this presentation that you can do, and there are many, this is just some that I thought about off the top of my head as I was preparing this. The first thing is that there's a website for the Equity Initiative, and you can take a look at it. There are a lot of tools and resources there, and it's probably a good place to get oriented a little bit better to what the initiative has done and how it thinks. And you can find various tools and publications and webinars there. Some of them are very, very technical, and they're targeted toward researchers and professional evaluators, but some of them are much more general and also targeted to program staff, people who are charged with delivering education activities on a day-to-day basis. There's a newsletter that you can subscribe to, which is a good way to kind of stay up to date on what's happening. You can also share your own work that you may be doing, and they can, if you send it into the initiative, they can, if it's relevant to the to the membership, they can send it back out to the through the newsletter to the rest of the members of the initiative. The second thing that we can do, both as individuals and as a collective, is to do better at this collecting, analyzing, and leveraging data that I talked about. So as we think about when we design our monitoring and evaluation, adding dimensions, and remember, dimensions are those things like the child, the language a child speaks, their sex, where they live, what their home learning environment looks like, their socioeconomic status, their migration status. Think about the things that might matter in your context and make sure that they're included into the data that we collect. Disability is is an emerging important issue. There are more and more tools available now to be able to do that well. Another one here is around improving data quality. Is data being collected according to best practices? One of the best things that we can do is if we collect data in a similar way to our peer organizations, it's much easier for us to share and compare data if we have defined socioeconomic status in the same way that they have. And there are tools on that the Equity Initiative has developed that can help do all of this. And then analyze for equity. So don't just look at those averages. Although averages can be important for understanding a general picture, when we really want to get down and understand if all children are learning, if we're serving all children, we really need to do this analysis for equity, not just at the baseline to say, yes, we targeted a poor group of children for this intervention, but did we actually improve equity? Did we reduce inequality through our activities? And then share and use data for advocacy and action. And this is something that I talked about when I was looking at the theory of change a couple of slides ago, which is making sure that we're leveraging, if we're getting better data and we're able to disaggregate and show how different groups of students are doing and maybe who's being left behind, that is probably some of the richest information we have to make our advocacy effective. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully I've left enough time, about 15 minutes here for question and answers. I don't know, Khadija, if you want to moderate or how you want that to work, but just let me know.
Yeah, sure. I know that Aline had a question. Aline, are you still on the line?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Eric. That was really, really interesting and very useful for West and Central Africa. This is Eileen. I'm the Regional Education Coordinator for West and Central Africa at the regional office. And in this region, we're partnering a lot with UNICEF and UNESCO and other partners to try to mainstream gender issues and inclusive education issues into education sector planning and analysis. And I was just wondering whether the initiative has developed some practical tools or guidance to help governments in these processes. I know UNESCO has a lot of guidance already, but maybe the initiative has some tools to add to that.
We do. So in the, there's a document on the website called Practical Recommendations for Analyzing Equity in Education. And the Practical Recommendations has sections for both gender and disability. We also have a task team that's working on disability, and Carolyn Aylesbury, who I think you know is our representative on that task team, and they are using some new tools. They're testing them out right now, tools that UNICEF and some others have developed to try to get a better picture of disability and its relationship to education. And we're always looking for more countries who are willing to test out those tools to see what works and what doesn't work, and hopefully help us improve them. So yes.
Thanks, that's very useful to know. Thank you.
Great. And then I'll take one more question, and then if anyone does have more questions, if you can type them in the box, and then I'll read them out for Eric to answer. But for now, does anyone have a question?
So also, I just typed my email into this, so that was a very quick answer to Eileen, but I'm happy to put you in touch with other people and give you a fuller answer later if you just get in touch by email.
Great, thanks, Eric. Any more questions?
Khadija, is Rob there?
Yes.
Rob, I don't know, maybe you could say a couple of words about how you see the sort of, what's your take on what I said, and what pieces do you think resonate, and what guidance would you have for members and offices in terms of how these different pieces link together, the policy advocacy, the data, the programming, strategy, partnership, etc.
Hi, Eric. Hi, everyone. Yeah, no, thanks very much. Really fantastic and helpful presentation, Eric, both on the broader issue of equity and what it is, how we understand it and why it matters, and specifically the helpful information about what you've been doing with the Education Equity Research Initiative to help fill that gap. I think it's really exciting to see Save the Children stepping into that space and doing it with others, because I think we recognise that, you know, when we were involved in the negotiations for the new Sustainable Development Goals framework, the two big things we were pushing for was to say the framework and the goal, particularly in education, needs to be looking at learning and quality. It can't just be talking about access, you know, from the last 15 years. And also it needs to be looking at equity, understanding who's learning and who's not learning. And that was a big kind of commitment for world leaders to put that in there, and that's great. But you know, now we're starting to see that, as you say, that rhetoric of equity coming through so strongly all over the place, but really big gaps in understanding how do we know who's learning and who's not learning, so that data piece that you've been talking about. And then now tools coming on stream to help with that. But also understanding what the kinds of policy and practice responses need to be. So if we know who's learning and who's not learning, what are the effective strategies to address that? And so I don't think we've immediately got the answers, but I think it's exciting if we can keep that conversation going, and for all the fantastic staff that are on the phone here and who will see this afterwards as well, you know, to kind of think about how does this help you in your context to think about who are we reaching with our programs, who are we not? What does the education sector plan in your country look like? Does it talk about equity? Increasingly, if it's getting GPE funding, it needs to be talking about equity. But how is it talking about equity? What kinds of targets are there? What are the strategies that are in place? And what things can we be thinking about to fill that gap, I think is is some of the areas I would think about in a policy and advocacy frame. I think the other thing to highlight is that, where we are within Save the Children is, we've made this very big commitment up until 2030, to align our strategy with the Sustainable Development Goals and to have a longer term strategy, so we're not always just in strategy cycles, and to kind of commit to that as a big organisation. And a really key part of that, which Torva Wang, the CEO of Save the Children Norway and the chair of our education global theme, always says is one of the huge commitments in there is the focus on the most deprived and the most marginalised. But we recognise that there's a journey for us to go on over these 15 years to understand better how we can live up to that ambition, as you put it, Eric. And so I think, we've broken that down into 3-year planning cycles. So we're coming towards the end of one of those now in 2018. And there will be opportunities over the next 6 to 8 months, I think, in each of the offices you're in, to think about what is our strategy for 2019 to 2021. And to think about the child rights situation analyses we do, how we design our portfolios and our programming. And so I would, I guess, encourage everybody that is involved in that in some way, or even if you're not, try and find out how you can get involved. And think about how we can at least raise the topic of equity there and collectively build some kind of shared knowledge and share best practice on how did we understand it in this context, what worked, what didn't work, and get a conversation going would be fantastic. So I think this webinar is the first start in that, and we hope to carry that on workplace and other things going forward. So that's just a few thoughts from me.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I think, it's saying that the organization during this SDG period, the organization that can say we have strategies that work for the poorest, the most marginalized children, those are the organizations whose work is really going to get recognized and it's going to get attention, because right now it's not enough to say ours works generally. You have to be able to say that. When I said that, I had that thing there, what works for whom? You have to be able to answer that for whom question, I think. And the organizations that are able to get out, and the ministries of education that are able to use data to identify children in need and to direct particular strategies towards them, that what works piece, and putting that together with for whom, those are the organizations that I think are really going to do well in the SDG period, because that's, if you have the ambition of reaching all children, that's the work that actually needs to be done.
Great. Thanks, Eric. We've got a few minutes left, so if anyone has any last questions, please do share.
Can I ask who's on the phone in terms of countries who've got represented, or anybody on Common Approach leads, or?
We've got Emily, who is doing the Girls Common Approach from Save UK.
Great.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Emily. I don't want to put particular people on the spot.
Hi,
I
Eric.
wonder if there are people who are on the phone who are really dealing with this firsthand, and I know you are with the girls' education work. How does the things you've heard today help you, resonate with you, or any thoughts you have would be great to hear.
Yeah, I think this is very relevant, and although I was dipping in and out of the presentation because I'm in the middle of something, I think it's quite relevant for our work in girls' education. We are currently working on a redesign for our Mozambique project, and this issue of equity is coming up in the research that we have done. There are a lot of issues to do with poverty, issues to do with economic, social barriers, cultural barriers, individual barriers, educational barriers to for girls to transition from primary to secondary, and we can already see a very huge gender gap in terms of the girls that are transitioning from primary to secondary, but also in some of the provinces, we realize that this is a problem for both boys and girls, especially in the mining, in the regions where boys and males migrate from the town or from the districts and the provinces to go and do some mining. So the tools that you have highlighted here, in fact, I've taken the address of the website because I want to go in and read more about it and see whether it can inform some of the interventions you are recommending for the next 3 years. But also the girls' education approach would benefit from this a lot. My question was, maybe you talked about this, but I don't know how we define equity in Save the Children.
Yeah, that was something I looked at, and the PowerPoint is a bit slow, so I'm not going to try to go back. But you can see, I think it's the second or the third slide has a bit of a graphic that tries to show in a picture form the difference between equity and equality. And what we want to look at with equity is a change in how education systems understand difference and provide supports that are needed differentially to different groups of children. So identifying who needs what and providing resources. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. That's an equal approach, one size fits all, but an equitable approach is one that directs additional resources to those individual children or groups of children that have particular needs.
Okay, thank you. I was just asking because I was in a British Council conference where they had the same slide, but there was a third piece where all the barriers were removed.
Right.
So everybody was on a level field and they could watch the match. I don't know whether you've seen that.
Yeah, there's a lot of versions. This is a very popular picture. There's a lot of versions. My favorite one is where it shows the reality, which is that poor child, the shortest child, is actually in a hole that's been dug in the ground. It shows that the starting position isn't even equal to begin with, and that there are many children who come in with such great disadvantages that they need more than just providing a little extra support. So yes, I have seen those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Emily. So we're almost at time. So what I would suggest is maybe, Eric, if you're happy for people to send any more questions that they have by email.
Yeah, and I'm happy to do that. Is again to take a look at the website. I think probably if you're the document called Practical Recommendations, if you look at the website and you want to see something, it's targeted mainly at researchers, but I think it gives you an idea of what we should be thinking about in order to improve that data side of our practice. And I think that the data is a driver. The better data we have, the smarter analyses we'll do. The smarter analyses we'll do, the better programming we'll do. The better programming we'll do, I think the better informed our policy and advocacy will be. So the Practical Recommendations document may be a good place to start. And please do email me with any questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. And thanks for a really interesting and informative presentation. Hopefully the start of lots more work on the issue of equity in education at Save the Children. And thanks to everyone who's joined us on the line as well, and for all your questions. A recording of this will be going up on Workplace on the global education community. So if you do know anyone that wanted to join and couldn't, look out for that, and we'll make sure it gets to everyone. So yeah, huge thanks. And Rob, just one more thing.
Just one final thing from me is just to say that what's really helpful about this is that I think it's starting to break down a term that we know has been around for a while in the organisation, but actually I personally think I would actually struggle to define and articulate it really clearly. So this is very helpful to start doing that. I just kind of want to encourage people to kind of say it's also fine if you feel like me and you're kind of trying to understand what this means, and that this is going to be a shared journey together. And so we'd love to hear back from you on how useful some of the tools are and other things, and what things we could do to help make that conversation easier. Because if information and tools aren't practical that we can actually use, then then that's not very helpful. And I think we kind of just recognise that that's really important. Now, there is a bit of a gap between, I think, the kind of the academic space talking about this and a big lofty strategy space talking about this, but actually this is really important in how we deliver programs and how we put together our work at a national and local level. And so we'd love to kind of find ways of breaking that down and making that as accessible as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Thanks, Rob. So yeah, thanks very much to everyone who's joined us. Eric, I don't know if you have anything else to finish on. Otherwise,
thank you everyone for giving an hour of your day.
Yeah, have a good rest of the day, everyone, and thanks for listening.
Bye.